The ground beneath Pompeii trembled without warning that fateful morning. It wasn't just a gentle shake. The cobblestones shuddered violently, sending slabs of marble crashing from rooftops as screams erupted through the streets. Imagine standing there, clutching a loved one's hand, watching the world you knew fracture apart in seconds. This wasn't just another earthquake. It was the first terrifying sign of Mount Vesuvius awakening from its slumber. For the people of Pompeii, life changed in an instant, but their stories didn't end there. Through scorched letters, hastily abandoned belongings, and the haunting plaster casts of those who couldn't escape, we've pieced together a survivor's tale of resilience against nature's fury. What makes Pompeii's tragedy so unforgettable isn't just the scale of destruction, it's the raw humanity preserved in the ashes. While most know the broad strokes of the eruption, few have heard the whispers of those who lived through its earliest hours. A merchant who fled with only a handful of coins, a mother who scribbled one last plea to the gods on her crumbling wall. These aren't just footnotes in history. They're windows into the terror, courage, and split-second decisions that defined survival. And today, we're stepping into their footprints. This journey won't just take us through the science of pyroclastic flows or the ruins of a frozen city. We'll walk alongside the people who felt the earth growl beneath them, who choked on the first plumes of ash, who faced an impossible choice: stay and risk burial, or flee into the unknown. By blending cutting-edge archaeology with newly uncovered accounts, we'll reconstruct the day Pompeii died, not as a distant historical event, but as a visceral human experience. The volcano's roar may have silenced a city, but the voices of its survivors still echo if you know where to listen. The first tremors came days before the eruption, gentle at first, like a distant rumble that could be mistaken for carts rolling over stone streets. Dogs howled without reason, birds fled the coastline, and the wells ran mysteriously dry. Yet life in Pompeii carried on. After all, earthquakes weren't uncommon in this region. The ground had shuddered before without consequence. Even when the air grew thick with the scent of sulfur, like rotten eggs carried on the breeze, few recognized it as anything more than a passing nuisance. The warnings were there, written in nature's own language, but without the knowledge we have today, the people had no way to decode them. Then came the morning of August 24th. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, would later describe the moment Vesuvius awoke in vivid detail, a towering column of smoke, like an umbrella pine, surging upward before collapsing under its own weight. To the people of Pompeii, it must have seemed surreal at first, almost beautiful. The sky darkened with ash, yet children still played in the streets. Merchants haggled over prices, and bakers pulled loaves from ovens. The mountain had grumbled before. Why would this time be any different? Modern volcanologists now recognize these signs as textbook precursors to disaster. Those minor quakes, magma shifting deep below the surface, the sulfurous air, gases escaping through newly formed fissures. Even the animals' panic makes tragic sense. Creatures attuned to vibrations humans couldn't feel. What's haunting is how ordinary it all seemed in the moment. The very clues that could have saved thousands were dismissed as quirks of daily life. By the time the sky began raining pumice stones, heavy as fists, the window for escape was already closing. The mountain had spoken, but its message went unheard until it was too late. Pliny the Elder's story is one of courage and tragic irony, a man who sailed toward disaster when everyone else was scrambling away. As commander of the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum, He had the resources to escape the eruption's path. But when his friend Rectina sent a desperate plea for help from her villa at the foot of Vesuvius, Pliny made a fateful decision. He ordered his warships repurposed into rescue vessels, turning them toward the billowing ash cloud with a scholar's curiosity and a soldier's resolve. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, would later recount every detail in letters that read like a real-time chronicle of catastrophe. The voyage began calmly enough. Pliny took notes as they sailed, observing the eruption's strange beauty, the way lightning flickered through the ash column, how pumice stones tapped against the ship's hull like hail. But as they neared the shore, the air grew thick with burning cinders. Sailors coughed violently, their eyes streaming from sulfurous fumes. Ash piled so high on the decks that the ships risked capsizing. Forced to abandon the landing, they changed course for Stabiae, where Pliny hoped to wait out the worst. What happened next remains etched in history. That night, as buildings shook and fiery debris rained down, Pliny collapsed on the beach. Some say it was the toxic gases. Others believe his asthma, worsened by the dense air, finally overwhelmed him. His companions fled, leaving his body buried under layers of ash, only to be rediscovered centuries later, face down in the sand, clutching a silver dagger as if ready to fight death itself. The contrast between Pliny's mission and the panicked flight of others is striking. While civilians ran blindly toward the sea or huddled in crumbling homes, he advanced with disciplined purpose. His last journey wasn't just about rescue, it was the first recorded attempt to confront a volcanic eruption with both bravery and scientific observation. In death, he became more than a Roman admiral. He became a bridge between ancient wonder and modern volcanology, his final hours preserved like a time capsule in the words of his nephew and the silent testimony of his bones. The streets of Pompeii erupted into chaos long before the volcano did. At first, the falling ash was light, almost like gray snowflakes dusting the market stalls. But within hours, it piled ankle-deep, then knee-deep, turning every step into a struggle. Families spilled from their homes, clutching bronze mirrors, sacks of grain, even pet dogs, anything they couldn't bear to leave behind. Children wailed as pumice stones pelted rooftops like artillery fire, shattering tiles onto the crowds below. Archaeologists would later uncover a haunting snapshot of this panic, a cluster of skeletons near the city gates, their bones tangled together in what was clearly a stampede. One figure stands out, a young mother, her body curled protectively around an empty space where her child must have been. Forensic science reveals even grimmer details. Some victims' hands were raised to shield their faces, their final moments etched into their bones. Others were found with their clothing fused to their skin by the intense heat, their jewelry melted into grotesque shapes. The most chilling discoveries come from underground chambers where entire families perished together, their lungs filled with volcanic ash. They'd chosen shelter over flight, barricading doors against the storm outside, unaware that the air itself would turn to poison. The cruelest dilemma was this: neither choice guaranteed survival. Those who fled risked being crushed by collapsing buildings or struck by flaming debris. Those who stayed faced slower suffocation as the air grew thick with toxic gases. Near the waterfront, a group of skeletons was found huddled around a pile of silver coins, not greed but desperation. They'd likely hoped to bribe their way onto a boat, only to be engulfed by the pyroclastic surge, a 600-degree avalanche of gas and rock that moved faster than a galloping horse. What's often forgotten is how long this horror unfolded. The eruption wasn't instantaneous. It gave Pompeii hours of mounting terror. In those final moments, some scratched messages into walls, not prayers to the gods but to future generations. One reads simply Sodom and Gomorrah, a biblical reference that shows how the catastrophe defied all explanation. Another, found near a child's skeleton, says, "Mother, I'm scared," in shaky cursive. These weren't just victims, they were people who laughed in these streets, haggled in these shops, and until that day believed tomorrow would come. The pyroclastic surge wasn't just fire and ash, it was an invisible wall of death, a hurricane of superheated gas and rock that raced downhill at nearly 100 miles per hour. Imagine standing on Pompeii's streets as the sky turned black, then feeling a scorching wind slam into you like a battering ram. Temperatures soared past 600 degrees, hot enough to vaporize flesh in seconds. This wasn't lava creeping slowly, it was a force that didn't just destroy but erased. Herculaneum's ruins tell an even grimmer story. While Pompeii was buried under falling ash, this coastal town faced the surge head-on. Archaeologists found skeletons clustered in boat sheds by the shore, their bones charred and contorted. Some still clutched bags of coins or tools, frozen mid-escape. The position of the bodies reveals the horror. People crouched together, arms over their heads, as if bracing against a storm they couldn't outrun. Unlike Pompeii's victims, many of whom suffocated under ash, these individuals were flash-cooked by the surge's heat. Their teeth exploded from the sudden temperature spike, and brain matter boiled inside their skulls, leaving dark stains in the bone. What made the surge so lethal was its deceptive nature. From a distance, it might have looked like a rolling cloud, almost peaceful. But inside that gray mass, gases reached temperatures rivaling a crematorium, while jagged volcanic rock pulverized everything in its path. Trees splintered like matchsticks, marble statues melted into grotesque shapes, and lead tiles on rooftops liquefied, dripping like wax. The surge didn't discriminate, it killed rich and poor, young and old, even animals in their stables, all in the same breath. Modern volcanologists compare it to a nuclear blast shockwave, but with one cruel difference. It left structures standing while annihilating every living thing inside. Walk Pompeii's ruins today, and you'll see walls still adorned with vibrant frescoes, their colors preserved under ash, proof that the surge was selective in its destruction. It didn't topple buildings, it simply emptied them of life. The few who survived the initial surge faced an even more insidious killer, the gas. Inhaling those fumes was like breathing shards of glass, searing lungs from the inside. Survivors' accounts from nearby towns describe birds dropping dead mid-flight, their wings stiffening before they hit the ground. Those who hid in cellars suffocated as oxygen vanished, replaced by toxic cocktails of carbon dioxide and hydrogen chloride. Yet amid this carnage, there are stories of eerie beauty. Pliny the Younger wrote of the surge's glow lighting up the night sky, like torches reflected in a mirror. For a brief moment, before the heat consumed everything, the doomed cities were bathed in an unnatural, almost celestial light. It's a haunting reminder that nature's deadliest forces often arrive with a terrible majesty, leaving behind not just ruins, but questions about what it means to outrace the unimaginable. Among the most haunting relics of Pompeii are not just the ruins, but the void's hollow spaces in the hardened ash where bodies once lay. When archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli poured plaster into these cavities in the 1860s, he didn't just uncover skeletons, he resurrected entire moments of terror frozen in time. The plaster seeped into every contour, capturing the folds of a mother's tunic as she shielded her child. The intricate braids of a young girl curled into a fetal position, even the sandal straps biting into the ankles of a man mid-stride. These casts aren't mere replicas, they're death masks etched by the volcano itself. One figure stands out in the Garden of the Fugitives, a crouching child no older than 7, arms wrapped around knees as if trying to vanish. The plaster preserved the texture of their tunics' weave and the way their hair clung to sweat-dampened skin. Nearby, a couple lies intertwined, their fingers laced together so tightly that archaeologists initially thought they'd fused. Their faces, though featureless, tilt toward one another in a final embrace, a silent testament to love's persistence even as the world burned around them. The process of creating these casts borders on alchemy. Workers carefully drill into the compacted ash until they hit the hollow left by decomposed flesh, then pour in liquid plaster like filling a mold. When the surrounding material is chipped away, what emerges is a sculpture of absence, a negative turned positive. Some casts still bear traces of their humanity, a wedding ring gleaming on a skeletal hand, the imprint of a wrinkled brow frozen in agony. But these discoveries stir deep ethical questions. Is it right to display a dying man's final contortions behind glass, his mouth forever open in a scream no one can hear? Museums wrestle with this dilemma daily. Some argue the casts are invaluable historical records, revealing details no scroll could, like the slave's iron collar still locked around his neck, proving some couldn't flee even if they wanted to. Others see them as unmarked graves, their shadows stretching across 2 millennia to remind us of the price of curiosity. Perhaps the most poignant cast isn't human at all. In the stable of a wealthy villa, a dog was found chained to a post, its body twisted in a frantic struggle against its bonds. The plaster captured every rib, every tendon strained to breaking point. This wasn't just a pet, it was a metaphor for Pompeii itself, a city that never stood a chance against the chain of inevitability. Modern technology adds new layers to the debate. CT scans of the casts now reveal bones hidden within the plaster, allowing scientists to reconstruct diets, illnesses, and causes of death without disturbing the figures. One scan showed a woman pregnant with twins, her hands cradling her belly in protective instinct. Another revealed a wealthy merchant with a mouthful of abscesses, his gold fillings shining like grim trophies. Visitors often speak of an uncanny presence in these halls, as if the air still vibrates with unfinished lives. The casts don't just show us how Pompeii's people died. They whisper how they lived through the calluses on a baker's hands, the elegant drape of a noblewoman's stola, the defiant posture of a soldier who stood his ground. In their silence, they ask us the hardest question archaeology can pose. When we stare into the faces of the past, are we seeking knowledge or bearing witness to a grief too vast for words? Not everyone in Pompeii met their end under the ash. Scattered among the ruins are clues to those who slipped through the volcano's grasp, like the half-packed sack of jewelry abandoned near the Nuceria gate, or the trail of scattered coins leading toward the sea. These fragments tell a quieter story, the ones who outran disaster. Take the wealthy banker whose villa was found with a fortune in silver still locked in his strongbox. He clearly left in a hurry, choosing life over riches. Or the family whose dining table was set for breakfast, bowls still full of eggs and bread, proof they fled at the first rumble without looking back. The geography of survival reveals brutal truths. Those nearest the city gates had a fighting chance, while residents in Pompeii's center faced a labyrinth of collapsing buildings. Archaeologists trace escape routes through trampled gardens and alleys where footprints in the ash show desperate sprints toward the harbor. Some made it as far as Stabii, only to be caught by the surge hours later. Others found refuge in Misenum, where Pliny the Younger watched the horror unfold from what he called safe but terrifying proximity. Why did some live while others perished? Social status played a cruel role. The wealthy had horses, carriages, and connections to commandeer boats. Slaves, however, were often left chained in cellars or ordered to guard property. A skeleton still wearing an iron collar was found in the gladiator barracks, his keys just out of reach. Even among the free, survival favored the young and agile. The elderly and infirm couldn't navigate streets buried under feet of pumas, let alone outrun a pyroclastic surge, yet there are exceptions that defy explanation. In Oplontes, a seaside town closer to Vesuvius than Pompeii, an entire family survived by barricading themselves in a wine cellar. Their secret, a ventilation shaft that somehow filtered the deadly gases. Meanwhile, in Herculaneum, a boat shed became a tomb for 300 souls who thought the sea would save them only for the surge to overtake them at the water's edge. The luckiest refugees became invisible to history, blending into towns far from the volcano's reach. A wax tablet found in Naples mentions a Pompeian merchant resuming business just weeks later. Another record describes a grieving widow who rebuilt her life in Cumae, remarrying and bearing children who would never know their birthplace. These survivors carried more than just memories. They became living bridges between the world before and after the cataclysm. What's most haunting isn't the randomness of who lived or died, but how closely their choices mirror our own instincts. Would you grab your child or your coin purse? Trust the sturdy stone walls or risk the open road? Pompeii's survivors didn't know they were making immortal decisions. They were simply reacting to a nightmare no one could have rehearsed. And that's what makes their stories so profoundly human. In the shadow of Pompeii's grand villas and bustling markets, an entire population lived and died without the freedom to run. While the wealthy fled with gold and silks, many of the city's enslaved men, women, and children remained trapped literally. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons still clamped in iron shackles, their bones forever frozen in desperate contortions against unyielding metal. One particularly harrowing discovery in the gladiator barracks revealed a young man crouched near the wall, his ankle fused to a rusted chain just inches from the key that could have freed him. These weren't just casualties of the eruption, they were prisoners of human cruelty, denied even the chance to face nature's wrath on their own terms. Yet their voices weren't entirely silenced. Scratched into the walls of taverns and brothels, graffiti preserves their names: Baracha, Ampliatus, Iris, simple declarations of existence etched where history rarely looked. One inscription near a bakery reads, "Antiochus hung out here with his sweetheart Cythera, a fleeting moment of tenderness amid oppression." Another, scrawled beneath a lewd drawing in the servants' quarters, jokes darkly, "The master's wine is watered down." These aren't just vandalism, they're proof of lives asserting themselves in the only spaces left to them. The contrast between their physical remains and these defiant marks cuts deep. The same hands that polished marble floors or hauled amphorae of wine found ways to say, "I was here." In the house of the Menander, a slave's quarters revealed a charcoal sketch of a sailing ship on the plaster, perhaps a dream of escape or a memory of a homeland across the sea. Elsewhere, a child's footprint pressed into wet clay alongside a master's stamp shows how the enslaved moved invisibly through spaces they built but never owned. Modern technology has begun restoring dignity to these lost lives. Bone analysis reveals chronic malnutrition and spinal deformities from ceaseless labor, yet also signs of resilience. A woman buried with a healing fracture, her bones telling of survival against impossible odds. DNA studies trace origins from Greece to North Africa, mapping forced journeys longer than the eruption's shadow. Some skeletons show teeth filed into patterns, a cultural practice their captors tried to erase. What haunts most isn't just the injustice, but the proximity of choice. In one villa, a slave's skeleton was found near the family's pet dog, both left behind, but only one by deliberate decision. Near the Nuceria Gate, a cluster of bodies includes a man in fine leather sandals next to another with bare, calloused feet, their fates intertwined yet worlds apart. Pompeii's ash preserved more than buildings. It fossilized the brutal hierarchy of an entire society, where survival wasn't just about speed or strength, but who was deemed worth saving. But the graffiti lingers like a whisper, turning walls into witness stands. Lucius Pinarius was here, declares one inscription, not in the elegant script of a poet, but the uneven letters of someone who likely stole literacy like crumbs from a master's table. Another simply states, "We too are one." Beside two carved handprints, a secret bond between souls the world tried to render nameless. In these cracks of light, the enslaved of Pompeii did more than perish. They insisted, even in death, on being remembered as more than property. Their chains may have held them fast, but their humanity refused to be buried. While Pompeii often steals the spotlight, its neighbor Herculaneum holds an even more extraordinary secret, a library frozen in time. Buried under 60 feet of volcanic material, the Villa of the Papyri was once a seaside retreat for Rome's elite, its halls lined with hundreds of scrolls that turned to charcoal in the eruption's searing heat. For centuries, these blackened lumps were considered unreadable relics until cutting-edge technology cracked them open without ever unrolling a page. X-ray imaging and artificial intelligence have now deciphered words hidden for nearly 2,000 years, revealing everything from lost works by Greek philosophers to grocery lists scrawled in the margins. One scroll, believed to be by the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, discusses music and pleasure in startlingly modern terms. Another contains a previously unknown history of Alexander the Great's campaigns, contradicting long-held accounts. But the real treasure might be lurking in the mundane, a hastily written note about a missing tunic, or a slave's tally of olive oil jars. These everyday fragments paint a richer, messier picture of Roman life than any polished statue or mosaic ever could. The villa itself is a marvel of preservation. Unlike Pompeii's ruins where organic materials decayed, Herculaneum's pyroclastic surge carbonized wood, food, and even fabric. Walking its halls feels eerily intimate. A loaf of bread sits petrified in an oven, a wooden cradle rocks empty, and a wax tablet lies open as if waiting for its owner's next thought. The scrolls were found in a room lined with bronze busts of philosophers, suggesting this wasn't just a wealthy man's collection, but a working scriptorium where ideas were copied and debated. What makes scholars hold their breath is the possibility of survivor accounts. Over 600 scrolls remain unread, and advanced algorithms are now teasing apart their layers like peeling an onion. Some may contain letters penned during the eruption's early hours, first-hand descriptions of the sky darkening or the sea retreating. Others could preserve voices history forgot, women poets, enslaved scholars, or merchants documenting trade routes now lost to time. The most tantalizing clue, a scroll case found near the villa's exit, its lid slightly ajar. Whoever packed it likely intended to save these words, fleeing with knowledge as their only treasure. In that single gesture, we see the opposite of Pompeii's panic, not just survival, but the determination to carry the past into an uncertain future. As lasers and neural networks resurrect these texts letter by letter, they're not just revealing ancient secrets, they're proving that even in catastrophe, some things refuse to burn. To the people of Pompeii, the earth shaking beneath their feet wasn't just geology, it was the gods speaking. Frescoes in homes and temples depicted Vulcan, the blacksmith of the gods, hammering beneath Mount Vesuvius long before the eruption. When the mountain finally exploded, many saw it as divine retribution, a belief etched into the frantic graffiti left on walls. Sodom and Gomorrah, one scrawled, comparing their fate to the biblical cities destroyed for their sins. Others scratched pleas to household gods, their tiny shrines filled with offerings of fruit and wine right up to the end. These weren't just superstitions, they were a civilization's framework for understanding the incomprehensible. The contrast between pagan and later Christian interpretations is striking. Roman religion saw disasters as signs of divine displeasure, but also as tests of piety, a negotiation between mortals and temperamental gods. Household larvaria, those miniature altars in every home, show families desperately trying to balance the scales with last-minute sacrifices. A preserved shrine in the house of the Golden Cupid still held charred figs and nuts, placed there as the sky rained fire. Meanwhile, Christian writers like Tertullian would later frame Pompeii's fall as outright punishment for decadence, pointing to the city's vivid brothels and gambling dens as proof. Yet the archaeological record complicates this morality tale. Yes, Pompeii had its pleasure houses, but it also had hospitals, soup kitchens, and a thriving community of freed slaves who'd built businesses. The same streets that hosted wild parties also saw quiet processions honoring Ceres, goddess of harvests, and communal feasts for neighbors in need. Religion here wasn't just about fear, it was the glue holding society together. When the ground shook, people didn't abandon their beliefs, they intensified them. A bakery's oven was found with loaves still inside, shaped like crescent moons to honor Luna, as if the baker thought piety might save him even as the roof caved in. What's most revealing are the gods Pompeii didn't call upon. Temples to Jupiter and Juno, Rome's chief deities, show little evidence of last-minute worship. Instead, people turn to household spirits and local protectors, the gods who knew their names. In the Villa of the Mysteries, a fresco shows a woman gripping a thesis, a staff sacred to Dionysus, her face a mask of terror. Was this art or a final ritual? The line between devotion and desperation blurs under a raining sky. Modern volcanologists might see magma chambers and tectonic plates, but to stand in these ruins is to feel the weight of another question. When faced with annihilation, do we seek answers in science or the divine? Pompeii's ashes preserved both the calculating water clocks in wealthy villas lying broken beside amulets clutched in skeletal hands. Perhaps the truest lesson isn't about which gods failed, but how tightly humanity clings to meaning, even as the world burns around it. Walking through Pompeii today, you'll see two cities layered atop each other, one frozen in ash, the other buzzing with camera clicks and tour guides. The cobblestones that once trembled under fleeing feet now support sneaker-clad tourists snapping selfies beside plaster casts of the dead. It's a surreal collision of past and present, raising uncomfortable questions. When does commemoration become exploitation? And how do we honor tragedy without turning it into a backdrop for vacation photos? The ethics of Pompeii tourism aren't black and white. On one hand, visitor fees fund vital preservation work, like the painstaking efforts to stabilize frescoes crumbling after 2,000 years of exposure. Teams of conservators work daily, using lasers to remove grime from murals and injecting glue into cracked walls. Without tourism, these treasures might vanish entirely. But on the other hand, the site's popularity has led to thoughtless damage. Visitors have scratched initials into ancient walls, stolen mosaic tiles as souvenirs, even posed grinning next to skeletons, acts that feel less like pilgrimage and more like violation. Technology offers a middle path. Virtual reality reconstructions now let you stroll through Pompeii's bustling markets or stand in the shadow of Vesuvius, all without touching a single ruin. Archaeologists collaborate with game designers to recreate the city down to the graffiti on tavern walls, allowing immersive exploration that leaves the physical site undisturbed. One particularly poignant VR experience follows a baker named Modestus on Eruption Day. humanizing history without reducing real ruins to a theme park. Yet even digital access can't resolve the deeper tension. Pompeii isn't just an archaeological site, it's a mass grave. The plaster casts aren't art installations, they're death masks of people who suffocated in agony. Some museums have begun draping black cloth over displays of human remains, treating them with the solemnity of a war memorial rather than the curiosity of a cabinet of curiosities. Italy's culture ministry recently banned disrespectful behavior at the site, but enforcement is spotty. The difference between education and entertainment often comes down to a visitor's willingness to listen, not just look. Perhaps the most hopeful sign is how modern Pompeii engages descendants. DNA projects have connected living Italians to specific skeletons, revealing family lines that survived the disaster. For them, visiting isn't tourism, it's tending to ancestors. One woman, upon learning her genetic link to a merchant found with his money pouch, began leaving coins at his cast, not as theft but as tribute. The question isn't whether we should remember Pompeii, but how to do so without repeating history's crueler lessons. When we walk those streets, we're not just observers. We're participants in a story about time, memory, and the fragile line between reverence and ruin. Mount Vesuvius isn't just a relic of the past, it's a ticking clock. Today, over 3 million people live within its shadow, their homes and streets sprawled across the same fertile soil that once doomed Pompeii. Modern Naples pulses with life just miles from the crater, a metropolis built on volcanic land that hasn't erupted since 1944. But don't let the quiet deceive you. Scientists rank Vesuvius as one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth, not because of its power alone, but because of the sheer density of humanity in its crosshairs. Volcanologists monitor the mountain's every whisper with networks of seismometers, gas sensors, and satellite eyes. They track the faintest tremors, measure ground deformation down to the millimeter, and sample the air for spikes in sulfur, a ghostly echo of the warnings Pompeii missed. Dr. Lucia Pappalardo, a leading researcher at the Vesuvius Observatory, describes their work as listening to a sleeping giant's breathing. The goal isn't just prediction, it's buying time. Current models suggest Naples would need at least 2 weeks to evacuate fully, a race against nature where every second counts, yet preparedness is a patchwork. While Italy boasts one of the world's most advanced evacuation plans, including color-coded zones and mandatory drills, reality complicates the blueprint. Narrow medieval streets in towns like Herculaneum can't handle modern traffic, and high-rise apartments in Naples' outskirts lack enough exits for swift escapes. Then there's human nature. Surveys reveal alarming gaps, residents who ignore sirens, families with no emergency kits, even stubborn elders who vow to stay with their land as their ancestors did. The ghost of Pompeii lingers not just in ruins, but in these fatalistic whispers. The most chilling parallel, complacency. Just as first-century Romans dismissed tremors as mundane, many modern Neapolitans treat Vesuvius as a backdrop rather than a threat. Farmers still plant vineyards on its slopes, developers build neighborhoods creeping ever closer, and tourists hike the crater rim for selfies. The volcano's long dormancy breeds false security, a lesson Pompeii etched in ash. As historian Dr. Marco Rossi notes, disaster memory fades faster than stone erodes. We rebuild not just cities but forgetfulness. Technology offers hope where geography does not. Early warning systems now link directly to smartphones, and AI analyzes data patterns faster than any human could. Drills simulate pyroclastic surges, teaching children to recognize the difference between normal smoke and an eruption's deadly plume. But the hardest challenge isn't science, it's scale. Pompeii had 20,000 souls to evacuate. Naples has 200 times that number, with highways that jam under weekend traffic, let alone panic. The question isn't if Vesuvius will wake, but when, and whether we've learned enough to rewrite the ending. Plaster casts in museums remind us what happens when ignorance meets inevitability. Yet walking Naples streets today, you'll find another kind of monument. Evacuation route signs painted on buildings, schools practicing volcano days, and scientists working in shifts to keep the mountain's secrets from becoming epitaphs. The past doesn't have to be prologue, but only if we choose to listen. Pompeii's winding streets, though charming, became death traps when Vesuvius erupted. The city's designed narrow alleys barely wide enough for two carts to pass, dead-end roads, and dense clusters of buildings turned panic into gridlock. Archaeologists have found skeletons piled near choke points, where fleeing crowds bottlenecked as pumice rained down. Even the famous stepping stones meant to keep feet dry during floods became obstacles, tripping those who ran in terror. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a failure of urban planning that multiplied the tragedy. Compare this to modern Tokyo, where earthquake drills are as routine as subway schedules. After the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake killed over 100,000 people, Japan reimagined its cities. Wide evacuation routes, shock-absorbing buildings, and public squares double as emergency hubs. Citizens practice tsunami tendenko, the art of fleeing without hesitation. Schoolchildren wear padded hoods, and skyscrapers sway rather than snap. Yet Tokyo's preparedness raises an uncomfortable question. Does infrastructure alone save lives, or does it breed complacency? In 2011, despite Japan's cutting-edge warnings, some residents hesitated during the Tohoku quake, convinced the seawalls would hold. Nature, as Pompeii taught us, doesn't negotiate with human confidence. The irony is that Pompeii's builders thought they were prepared, those stepping stones. Part of a sophisticated drainage system to handle storms, the tall, tightly packed buildings designed for shade and communal living, even the city gates had strategic placements for defense. But resilience against invaders or weather meant nothing against a pyroclastic surge. Today's cities face similar blind spots. Naples has evacuation plans, but its historic center's labyrinthine alleys mirror Pompeii's. Seattle's volcanic contingency maps don't account for traffic jams during a Mount Rainier eruption. We've swapped one set of vulnerabilities for another. Perhaps the starkest lesson lies in who survived. Pompeii's wealthy had private courtyards and multiple exits, some even owned seaside villas for quick escapes. The poor, crammed into upstairs apartments or workshops with single doorways, stood little chance. Modern disasters repeat this pattern. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, those without cars or resources were left behind. In volcanic zones like Mexico City, informal settlements often lack marked evacuation routes. Technology can't fix inequality's role in survival, but there's hope in hybrid thinking. Kyoto blends ancient wisdom with modern engineering. Its fire breaks date back to the 17th century, yet its emergency apps use real-time satellite data. Reykjavik practices volcano tourism, turning eruption sites into educational trails so locals know the land's moods. The real test isn't whether we've outpaced Pompeii's mistakes, but whether we've learned to respect chaos. A city can have all the drills in the world, but if its people don't believe disaster will touch them, the past is doomed to repeat, just with taller buildings and faster disasters. Among the plaster casts of Pompeii's human victims, one figure tugs at the heartstrings unlike any other, a dog forever frozen in the act of struggling against its chain. The iron collar around its neck bears an inscription that reads, "Delicate," a cruel irony for an animal that died anything but gently. Archaeologists found its body twisted in agony, teeth clenched around the metal links as if sheer willpower could break them. This wasn't just a pet, it was a companion left behind, a silent witness to the unfathomable choices disaster forces upon us. Nearby, other animal remains tell equally haunting stories. A turtle preserved mid-step, its shell singed by falling embers, and a stable full of horses still harnessed to a cart, their bones arranged in frantic flight. Animals sensed the danger long before humans did. Birds abandoned the skies days before the eruption, their instincts sharper than any Roman augur's divinations. Dogs howled incessantly in the weeks leading up to the catastrophe, while livestock grew restless, kicking at stall doors. Modern volcanologists recognize these behaviors as responses to infrasound, low-frequency vibrations preceding eruptions that animals detect but humans miss. A pig skeleton found curled in a basement suggests some creatures sought shelter instinctively, while others, like the famed Garden of the Fugitive's dog, were trapped by human decisions. What makes these discoveries so piercing is how they collapse time. That dog's collar could belong to any beloved pet today, the engraved name, the polished wear from countless pats. A stable's feeding trough still holds petrified oats, reminding us these animals weren't just property. They had routines, personalities, trust. The turtle's final steps, preserved in ash, mirror the frantic scurrying of wildlife during modern wildfires, a timeless dance of survival. Today's disaster planners grapple with this legacy. During Hurricane Katrina, an estimated 60,000 pets were left behind in New Orleans, leading to the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. Yet debates rage. Should evacuation buses carry animals? Who prioritizes a crate over a human seat? Pompeii's dog forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Disaster response reveals who we value. In Herculaneum, a wealthy family's skeleton was found with their lapdog, suggesting some chose to die together rather than abandon their companion. Meanwhile, the gladiator barracks' chained guard dogs had no such choice. The most poignant finds aren't bones but traces of care: a parrot's cage with extra perches for comfort, a cat's bell buried near a kitchen, perhaps a mouser rewarded with scraps. These details whisper of bonds transcending utility. When archaeologists uncovered a stable with a horse's skeleton still wearing decorative bridle plaques, they didn't just find livestock. They found a creature someone had taken pride in, maybe even loved. Modern eruptions keep writing this story. During the 2018 Kilauea disaster in Hawaii, residents defied orders to rescue chickens and goats. In Iceland's recent volcanic threats, farmers moved entire flocks to safety before their own belongings. Pompeii's legacy isn't just about how animals died, it's about how their presence forces us to define humanity in the face of chaos. That dog named Delicate, forever straining toward freedom, isn't just a relic, it's a mirror. The ovens of Pompeii still held loaves of bread when archaeologists uncovered them, not just crumbs but entire round loaves, their surfaces cracked like dry earth. These weren't mere leftovers, they were snapshots of breakfast interrupted. Forensic botanists analyzing the charred remains found something astonishing. The bread bore baker's stamps, revealing not just what people ate but who made it. One loaf, carbonized to perfection, bore the name Modestus, likely the baker who perished trying to save his last batch. The grain itself tells a story, a mix of local wheat and imported barley, speckled with poppy seeds and crushed olives, a recipe that crossed social classes but varied wildly in quality. The wealthy dined on fine white loaves while the poor chewed gritty, bran-heavy slabs, but bread was just the beginning. In the ruins of a thermopolium, a Roman fast food counter, jars held remnants of duck, fish, and even dormice, a delicacy fattened in clay pots for aristocratic feasts. The real revelation came from a sludge at the bottom of an amphora. Garum, the fermented fish sauce Romans drizzled on everything. Chemical analysis showed this batch was premium grade, made from Spanish mackerel and aged for months. The poorer quarters, by contrast, had cheaper versions bulked out with shellfish scraps. Even in catastrophe, Pompeii preserved the stark divide between those who dined on delicacies and those who stretched a single sardine across a family's pottage. The most intimate glimpses come from a carbonized cookbook in Herculaneum's Villa of the Papyri. One recipe for stuffed dates calls for crushing pepper, nuts, and honey, ingredients found in the villa's pantry, still sealed in glass jars. Another details a lavish dish of flamingo tongues, a status symbol so extravagant that even wealthy Pompeians might have reserved it for special occasions. Recreating these meals today isn't just culinary archaeology, it's a way to taste the rhythms of daily life. The wealthy relished spices from India and wine from Crete, while workers gulped down chickpea stews from communal cauldrons. What's haunting isn't the disparity, but the normalcy. A child's skeleton was found with a fig clutched in its hand, the fruit's seeds still intact after 2 millennia. In a tavern, a half-finished bowl of lentils sat beside a dice game, the bones showing someone's last throw. These weren't grand feasts or ritual offerings, just ordinary moments frozen mid-bite. The rich might have dined on peacock, but it's the humble olive pits and fish bones that speak loudest. They remind us that Pompeii wasn't just a city of frescoes and forums. It was a place where people craved breakfast, argued over stale bread, and reached for a last bite as the sky turned black. The final irony: some foods outlived their eaters. Jars of walnuts, their shells split by heat, still release a faint, nutty aroma when opened. Honey, sterile and eternal, remains edible to this day, a sweet echo of lives cut short. In these remnants, we don't just see what Pompeians ate, we taste their hopes for a meal that would, like all meals before it, be followed by another. Pompeii wasn't a time capsule sealed in pristine perfection. It was a wounded city long before Vesuvius finished it. The romantic notion of a town, frozen in time, crumbles under the weight of evidence. Looters were picking through the ruins within weeks of the eruption, prying gold from skeletons and smashing statues for salvageable bronze. Even nature played thief. Winter rains seeped into ash layers, collapsing fragile walls, while roots of invasive plants split frescoes like brittle parchment. The real shock: much of the damage wasn't ancient at all. Early archaeologists in the 1700s tunneled recklessly through buildings, hoarding treasures while discarding everyday objects as trash. One digger's journal boasts of extracting 30 pounds of silver from a single villa, never mentioning the charred papyrus scrolls he tossed aside as kindling. The city's scars run deeper than theft. Walking Pompeii's streets today, you'll notice mismatched columns and half-repaired facades. These aren't restoration efforts, they're proof the city was mid-recovery from a massive earthquake 17 years earlier. Excavations in the insula of the chaste lovers reveal a shocking sight. Elegant dining rooms with cracked walls hastily patched with crude brick, next to piles of unused marble waiting for repairs that never came. The forum's grand temples stood scaffolded when the ash fell, their pediments stacked with freshly carved stones yet to be placed. This wasn't a flawless snapshot of Roman life. It was a community limping toward normalcy when disaster struck twice. Modern laser scans expose more contradictions. Beneath the iconic Last Supper scenes of food on tables, researchers found older murals plastered over remnants of a city constantly reinventing itself. Even the famous body casts tell a darker truth. Many contorted postures once attributed to volcanic agony actually show injuries from collapsing roofs during the earthquake. Their bones healed crookedly before death. The volcano didn't preserve a perfect moment, it buried a place already fractured by time and turmoil. Perhaps the most poignant debunking comes from House of the Garden. Here, archaeologists found a wall scratched with two dates, 16 years since the quake and 2 days before the kalends of September. The writer wasn't commemorating disaster, they were counting down to a wedding. Pompeii's greatest lesson isn't about sudden destruction, it's about resilience. Every patched wall and unfinished repair whispers the same truth: life here wasn't paused. It was fighting to continue. The merchant clutched his handful of coins as he ran, the screams of his children still ringing in his ears. He'd left them behind when the roof collapsed, not out of cowardice, but because his wife had shoved him toward the door with a single command: live. For the survivors of Pompeii, escape wasn't freedom, it was a life sentence of unanswered questions. What if they'd waited 5 more minutes? What if they'd taken a different street? That merchant, whose name we'll never know, likely walked the rest of his days with invisible wounds deeper than any lava could carve. Modern psychologists recognize this torment all too well. The crushing weight of survival when others perished, a burden ancient Romans had no language to describe. Decades of research on modern volcanic disasters reveal eerie parallels. Survivors of Mount St. Helens 1980 eruption showed elevated rates of nightmares and hypervigilance, their brains stuck in loops of reliving the ash-choked air. After Guatemala's Fuego volcano erupted in 2018, displaced families reported phantom sensations of heat on their skin years later, a phenomenon neurologists link to trauma rewiring sensory memory. These aren't just passing fears, they're seismic shifts in how the mind processes near-death experiences. When archaeologists uncovered a refugee's scrawled note in Naples, "I dream of their faces every night," they weren't just reading words. They were holding 2,000-year-old evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder before the term existed. The psychological scars transcended class. A wealthy Pompeian who fled to Misenum might have rebuilt his villa, but the smell of sulfur from local hot springs could still trigger panic. A slave who outran his chains likely jumped at every rumbling cart, his body remembering the mountain's growl. Even Pliny the Younger, safe across the bay, wrote of insomnia and guilt haunted by his uncle's death while he survived. Modern therapy calls this moral injury, the anguish of failing to save others despite impossible odds. The bones of Pompeii's victims tell us who died, but the silence of those who lived speaks volumes about how trauma echoes across generations. Disaster psychologists now see Vesuvius as a case study in resilience. Some survivors channeled their grief into action, like the baker who reopened his ovens in Neapolis to feed other refugees. Others turned to art. Frescoes in post-eruption Roman villas feature startling depictions of fiery mountains, suggesting therapeutic storytelling. These ancient coping mechanisms mirror modern interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy and community rebuilding projects. The key difference: today we understand trauma isn't weakness, it's the price of survival. When a child's skeleton was found curled beside Pompeii's gates, her arms wrapped around nothing, we saw more than a victim. We saw the empty space where someone's survival guilt began. The most poignant lesson lies not in the ash but in the aftermath. In Herculaneum, a refugee's graffiti reads, "I was here, but you were not." It's a simple line, yet it captures the isolating chasm between those who escaped and those left behind. 2 millennia later, survivors of wildfires and tsunamis describe the same unshakable loneliness, the sense of carrying ghosts in their peripheral vision. Pompeii's ruins remind us that disasters don't end when the earth stops shaking. They live on in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where memory and molten rock burn just as deep. The song Pompeii by Bastille pulses with an upbeat rhythm and lyrics about walls tumbling down, turning a city's annihilation into an infectious pop anthem. It's far from alone. Hollywood has spun Pompeii's tragedy into everything from sword and sandals epics to doomed love stories, each retelling sanding down the raw edges of history into something more palatable. Take the 2014 film Pompeii, where Kit Harington's gladiator races against lava to save his lover, their final kiss immortalized in ash. It's cinematic, it's dramatic, and it's almost entirely fiction. The real Pompeii didn't preserve romantic embraces. It captured people alone, faces buried in their arms or curled into themselves, their final moments marked by solitude rather than cinematic embraces. This romanticization isn't harmless. When disasters become backdrops for love stories, the real victims fade into set dressing. The infamous Lovers of Pompeii plaster casts, often cited as proof of eternal romance, are actually two separate individuals, likely strangers, their bodies fused together by chance in the chaos. Yet postcards and souvenir shops sell their image as a symbol of undying passion, erasing the truth that most died terrified and separated from loved ones. Even the term "frozen in time" is a misnomer. The bodies decomposed long before the ash hardened, leaving hollow voids. The casts we see today are plaster poured into those spaces centuries later, not instantaneous snapshots but echoes of absence. Pop culture's obsession with Pompeii often prioritizes spectacle over substance. Video games like Assassin's Creed depict the eruption as a thrilling obstacle course, while novels paint it as divine punishment for decadence. Both ignore the ordinary lives lost: the baker who died mid-loaf, the child clutching a pet rabbit, the enslaved woman whose iron collar trapped her in place. The real tragedy lies in their anonymity reduced to props while fictional heroes dominate the narrative. But there's a flip side. Some adaptations, like Robert Harris's novel Pompeii, use fiction to illuminate history's gaps. His engineer protagonist races to fix the city's failing aqueducts, mirroring real infrastructure decay before the eruption. Even The Last Days of Pompeii, an 1834 novel, sparked public interest in excavations, funding early archaeology. Entertainment isn't the enemy, simplification is. The question isn't whether artists should reinterpret Pompeii, but whether they honor the weight of its story. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what these retellings omit. No blockbuster shows the thousands who survived, rebuilding their lives in distant cities. No song mentions the graffiti left by refugees, not poetic last words, but practical notes like "Gaius was here" or reminders to buy olive oil. These mundane traces, not Hollywood's grand gestures, capture how life stubbornly persists. When we reduce Pompeii to a cautionary tale or a love story, we risk forgetting the very humanity we claim to memorialize. The ash didn't just preserve bodies. It sealed a million ordinary moments, and those deserve as much attention as the spectacle of their ending. When Mount Vesuvius tore open in 79 AD, it didn't just bury Pompeii, it cast a shadow across the entire planet. Sulfur dioxide blasted 18 miles into the stratosphere, swirling into a toxic veil that drifted on global winds. Within months, Chinese scholars recorded strangely dimmed sunlight and summer frosts killing crops, while Roman accounts describe blood-red sunsets lingering for years. The proof lies locked in Arctic ice cores, layers of ancient snowfall preserving microscopic ash and sulfate spikes like tree rings of disaster. These frozen time capsules reveal Vesuvius wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a planetary fever that dropped temperatures by nearly 2 degrees Celsius for almost 2 years. Grape harvests failed as far away as France, and North African droughts sparked migrations. the volcano's reach defied borders, proving how interconnected Earth systems truly are. Today, scientists study this event as a chilling parallel to modern climate threats not from warming, but from sudden cooling. A Yellowstone-scale eruption could pump 10 times more sulfur into the atmosphere than Vesuvius, triggering a volcanic winter where global agriculture collapses. The difference, 79 AD had a population of 200 million to weather the storm. Today, 8 billion rely on fragile supply chains. One simulation showed even a moderate eruption like Indonesia's Tambora in 1815, which caused the year without a summer, would now leave over 1 billion people food insecure. The same ice cores that record Vesuvius's fingerprint also hold warnings. Similar eruptions happen roughly twice every millennium, yet there's a cruel irony in Pompeii's legacy. While we fear supervolcanoes, human activity now dwarfs their climate impact. The 1991 Pinatubo eruption cooled Earth by half a degree for a year, equivalent to just 6 days of current carbon emissions. Vesuvius's devastation came from nature's unpredictability, but today's threats stem from our own hands. The ash that smothered Pompeii at least fertilized soils for future generations. Microplastics and radioactive isotopes leave no such silver lining. Perhaps the lesson isn't just Earth's fragility, but our misplaced priorities. We drill Yellowstone for warning signs while pumping greenhouse gases at record rates, as if preparing for one apocalypse only to invite another. Pompeii's ruins remind us that civilizations can vanish in a breath, not just from fire and ash, but from failing to read the warnings written in the sky. The ice cores don't just preserve ancient disasters, they hold mirrors to our own. The women of Pompeii left behind more than just skeletons. They left legacies etched in bronze mirrors, wax tablets, and even the vibrant tiles beneath their feet. Take the Bikini Girls mosaic from the House of the Women, a sunlit scene of young athletes tossing weights and playing ball, their muscular frames clad in strips of fabric startlingly modern. This wasn't male fantasy. It was a celebration of female vitality, perhaps commissioned by the home's matriarch to showcase her daughter's prowess. Yet just streets away, archaeologists uncovered a far grimmer relic, the skeleton of a pregnant woman, her pelvis fractured from collapsed debris, the tiny bones of her unborn child curled beneath her ribs. These two discoveries, side by side, shatter any single narrative of Pompeii's women. They were not just victims or ornaments, they were poets, merchants, and athletes whose stories demand to be heard. Legal tablets from the ruins reveal women like Eumatia, a wealthy entrepreneur who funded Pompeii's largest public building, a grand wool market that doubled as a political hub. Her statue, found near the Forum, shows her draped in a stola reserved for Rome's elite, her inscription boasting patronage typically claimed by men. Then there's Julia Felix, who turned her lavish estate into a sort of ancient bed and breakfast after the earthquake, leasing out baths and gardens to tourists. Her advertisements, painted in bold red letters on her walls, promised elegant quarters for respectable guests, proving business acumen wasn't gendered. Even enslaved women carved out agency. Scrawled on a tavern wall is a love note between two women, one signing as the innkeeper's daughter, the other as her heart's thief. But disaster magnified inequalities. The pregnant skeleton found near the gladiator barracks wore no jewelry, just a simple iron ring, likely a slave's token. Forensic analysis shows she was malnourished, her teeth worn from grinding grain for others' bread. Contrast her with another find, a noblewoman's skeleton draped in gold filigree, her arms still circled by serpent-shaped bracelets symbolizing fertility. Both died the same horrific death, but one was buried in finery, the other in obscurity. The most haunting voice belongs to Sulpicia Lepidina, whose letters were preserved in the nearby military town of Vindolanda. Though not from Pompeii, her words complaining about a friend's neglect, scolding her husband for forgetting her birthday echo across the centuries. They remind us that these women weren't so different from us, fussing over fashion, trading gossip, balancing ambition and expectation. A set of ivory hairpins found in a collapsed shop, their ends shaped like Venus, speaks to vanity. A wax tablet detailing a loan repayment proves financial savvy. Disaster didn't erase gender, it fossilized its contradictions. The same ash that smothered the pregnant slave also preserved her neighbor's cosmetics. Jars of lead-based whitener, coal for lining eyes, even a tin of rose-scented blush. These women primped as their world darkened, clung to routine as roofs caved in. Perhaps that's the most human detail of all, the instinct to assert identity, whether through poetry or perfume, even when the sky is falling. In the shadow of Pompeii's grand villas, the smallest victims left the most haunting traces. A toddler's crib was found still rocking in the ash, its wooden frame carbonized into delicate charcoal, the impression of a tiny body visible in the volcanic dust. Nearby, a set of ivory dice lay scattered across a tavern floor, clutched in the skeletal hand of a teenager mid-game when the world ended. Childhood here wasn't a separate realm of innocence, it was woven into the fabric of daily survival. Infants slept in wicker baskets near bakery ovens for warmth, while preteens hauled water from fountains in clay jugs nearly as tall as themselves. The House of the Golden Bracelet holds one of archaeology's most devastating discoveries, a mother's skeleton curled around the hollow space where her infant had been. Plaster poured into the void revealed every fold of her stole stretched taut as she tried to shield the child with her own body. Forensic analysis shows she was barely more than a child herself, perhaps 14, her pelvic bones still narrow from a recent traumatic birth. Nearby, a wealthy merchant's home yielded another tragic contrast. A silver rattle adorned with tiny bells, its handle engraved, "To my son Lucius, may you outlive me." That wish, like so many others, went unfulfilled. Yet Pompeii's children weren't just victims, they were vibrant participants in city life. Graffiti in an alley preserves a crude chalk drawing of a gladiator, signed, "Marcus made this," in wobbly letters. A bakery's payroll lists a 12-year-old as head miller, his small hands likely scarred from hours turning the grain grindstone. The difference between then and now collapses in moments like these. A carbonized loaf bears teeth, marks from a child's impatient nibble, while a fresco in the House of the Vetii shows boys playing tug of war, their faces alight with the same competitive joy seen on playgrounds today. The cruelest finds are those that mirror modern parenting instincts. A small skeleton near the amphitheater wears iron cleats, a child athlete dressed for the big game. Another clutches a wooden sword, perhaps imagining himself a hero like those in the arena. Most haunting is the collection of amulets found around young necks, carved amber to ward off evil, bulla pouches with protective charms, even a tiny glass vial of lavender oil to soothe nightmares. These weren't just decorations, they were a parent's hope made tangible, armor against a world far more dangerous than ours. Medical research on the young bones reveals brutal truths. Growth interruptions in limb bones show cycles of famine, while teeth pocked with cavities speak of honey-laced treats. Some adolescent skeletons bear stress fractures from years of hauling heavy loads, their spines curved like old men's. Yet there are also signs of care: a club foot expertly bound with leather supports, a skull showing evidence of trepanation surgery to relieve pressure. Even in catastrophe, the lengths parents went to protect their children resonate across millennia. Perhaps the most poignant artifact isn't a toy or a tool, but a wax tablet from Herculaneum. In shaky but determined cursive, a child wrote, "If you love me, come home before dark." The words could have been scribbled yesterday. That's the heartbreak of Pompeii's youngest victims, not just how they died, but how vividly they lived. Their hopscotch grids scratched into courtyard stones still wait for the next jump, their pet doves' skeletons perched in cages as if expecting morning feed. The ash preserved not an end, but 1,000 interrupted beginnings. The marketplace of Pompeii didn't just trade in local wine and olives, it buzzed with the languages of merchants from 3 continents. Stroll through the ruins today, and you'll find peppercorns from Kerala still clinging to the bottom of a bronze spice jar, their pungent aroma long faded but their origin unmistakable. In the House of the Faun, archaeologists uncovered an emerald from Egypt's eastern desert, its facets cut to catch the Mediterranean light, while a nearby wine cellar held amphorae stamped with Greek letters boasting vintages from Crete. These weren't exotic rarities, they were everyday luxuries in a city that saw itself as the beating heart of a vast commercial network. A receipt scribbled on wax lists payment for silk from China's Han Dynasty, proof that Pompeii's reach stretched farther than even its residents might have imagined. What's staggering isn't just the diversity of goods, but the speed of their arrival. Analysis of shipwrecks and road stations reveals a supply chain as efficient as modern logistics. Spanish olive oil reached Pompeii's tables within 6 weeks of pressing, while North African grain sailed in before the harvest dust had settled. The wealthy dined on flamingo tongues preserved in Libyan salt, seasoned with Indonesian long pepper, all served on glassware blown in Syrian workshops. This wasn't just trade, it was a precursor to globalization, where a middle-class homeowner might own a carved ivory statuette from Sri Lanka just as casually as we display an IKEA shelf. Yet this interconnectedness carried hidden vulnerabilities. When Vesuvius erupted, it didn't just silence Pompeii, it sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean economy. Records from Alexandria show a sudden glut of unsold papyrus rolls meant for Campanian scribes, while olive groves in Baetica scrambled to redirect shipments now lacking buyers. The disaster exposed how tightly regional economies had knotted themselves around this one bustling hub. Fast forward 2,000 years, and the parallels are unnerving. A single grounded container ship in the Suez Canal can now trigger global shortages, just as the blockage of Pompeii's port left shelves empty from Gaul to Carthage. The lesson isn't just about fragility, it's about resilience. Dig deeper into Pompeii's ruins, and you'll find evidence of rapid adaptation. A wine merchant's ledger shows him switching suppliers to Sicily within months of the eruption, his handwriting growing frantic but determined. A bakery's grain stores reveal an abrupt shift from Egyptian wheat to local spelt, a pragmatic pivot when trade routes faltered. These weren't just survival tactics, they were proof that globalization, even when fractured, leaves behind networks that can regrow. Today's world faces its own version of Pompeii's reckoning, not from volcanoes, but from pandemics and political upheavals that snap supply chains like brittle thread. When COVID grounded flights, pharmacies in Nairobi ran short of German-made insulin, just as Pompeii's apothecaries must have panicked when Syrian medicinal routes stopped arriving. The difference, our web of dependence is exponentially more complex. A smartphone relies on rare earth minerals from 6 countries, assembled across 3 continents, a vulnerability the ancients never imagined. Perhaps the most poignant artifact is a child's wooden doll, found in a Pompeii sewer where it was likely washed by floodwaters. Carved from North African cedar, dressed in Spanish linen, and stuffed with Baltic amber beads to rattle like a modern toy, it's a testament to how deeply trade touched even the most intimate corners of life. That doll's journey mirrors the stuffed animals on today's container ships, symbols of comfort traveling across perilous distances. The ash that preserved it also asks us a silent question. In a world where everything is connected, what happens when the threads begin to burn? Rebuilding began before the ash had even cooled. Survivors of Pompeii's devastation didn't just wander aimlessly. They marched northwest toward Neapolis, modern-day Naples, dragging carts laden with salvaged tools and heirlooms. Archaeologists tracing their footsteps found evidence of this grim exodus. Coins dropped along evacuation routes, makeshift campsites with charred cookware, even graffiti in neighboring towns listing names of the missing. But what's most surprising isn't that they fled, it's how quickly some returned. Within months, looters were tunneling through the ash like termites, shattering walls to reach silver dining sets and bronze statues. Legal tablets from Puteoli record court cases over stolen goods, proving how chaos and opportunity blossomed side by side in the disaster's wake. Naples became a mirror of what Pompeii had been, but with scars. Refugees rebuilt bakeries using salvaged millstones from their buried hometowns, kneading dough with hands still cracked from volcanic grit. Wealthy families commissioned mosaics depicting Vesuvius as a lesson rather than a threat, their new villas strategically positioned along escape routes. The Roman government, typically hands-off with disasters, took unprecedented steps: tax moratoriums for survivors, land grants in safer regions, even state-funded funerals for the unclaimed dead. This wasn't just recovery, it was societal metamorphosis. Modern parallels emerge in places like New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina. There, as in ancient Campania, the poorest faced the cruelest choices. Wealthy Pompeians had multiple homes to flee to, just as New Orleans' affluent could afford Houston apartments while waiting for the waters to recede. Both disasters birthed opportunistic disaster capitalism. In 79 AD, it was speculators buying ash-covered land for pennies. In 2005, it was contractors charging desperate homeowners triple for repairs. Yet resilience found ways to flourish. Just as Neapolitan bakers stamped their loaves with Vesuvius motifs as a badge of survival, Katrina survivors painted jazz funeral murals on rebuilt houses, turning trauma into identity. Fukushima tells a darker version of this story. Like Pompeii's refugees who returned for heirlooms despite toxic air, Japanese evacuees risked radiation to retrieve family altars and photo albums. The difference lies in timescale, where Pompeii's ash became fertile soil within decades. Fukushima's exclusion zones may remain lethal for generations. Yet even there, innovation blossoms. Farmers grow flowers in radiation-filtering greenhouses, just as first-century winemakers eventually cultivated vines on Vesuvius slopes. The deepest lesson lies in what survivors chose to carry forward. Pompeii's refugees replicated their lost city's bakeries but abandoned its cramped tenements, designing wider streets and earthquake-resistant foundations. New Orleans raised homes on stilts after Katrina. Tokyo built tsunami walls that double as parks. Disaster rewrites cultural DNA, preserving traditions worth keeping while discarding vulnerabilities. That tension between memory and progress echoes in every tile laid over Pompeii's ashes, every Mardi Gras parade through New Orleans' repaired streets. Survival isn't just about rebuilding what was lost, but deciding what deserves to rise again. Every trowel that scrapes through Pompeii's ash unearths an ethical dilemma as layered as the volcanic strata itself. When archaeologists brush dust from a skeleton's fingers, are they revealing history or violating a grave? The debate sharpens with each new excavation season, pitting scientific curiosity against the quiet plea of the dead to lie undisturbed. Indigenous communities worldwide offer a stark contrast to Western archaeology's approach. The Maori, for instance, consider human remains tapu sacred, requiring ceremonial repatriation if disturbed. Meanwhile, at Pompeii, tourists peer at plaster casts of contorted bodies, some snapping selfies as if these weren't once living, breathing people who met agonizing ends. The disconnect chills. Recent discoveries only deepen the tension. In 2021, thermal imaging revealed untouched rooms beneath Reggio 5, their murals still vibrant, their artifacts perfectly preserved. The potential knowledge is intoxicating. Could these hold lost Latin texts or revolutionary insights into Roman medicine? But at what cost? Each dig risks damaging fragile organic materials, wooden looms disintegrating upon exposure, or carbonized figs crumbling to dust after 2 millennia in stable darkness. The thrill of discovery battles the sobering truth that excavation is by nature destruction. Even the famed body casts, once celebrated as scientific triumphs, now spark unease. Pouring plaster into voids where flesh decomposed feels uncomfortably akin to gawking at a mass grave. Indigenous methodologies offer alternative frameworks. The Zuni people of North America, for example, collaborate with archaeologists to rebury ancestral remains after study, balancing research with reverence. In Australia, Aboriginal elders guide excavations of sacred sites, ensuring artifacts are handled with ceremonial care. Pompeii, however, lacks living descendants to speak for its dead. Does that absolve us or demand even greater caution? Some scholars argue for a moratorium on new digs, using non-invasive technologies like ground-penetrating radar to map the city without disturbing it. Others counter that halting research would freeze our understanding, leaving countless stories locked in ash. The heart of the conflict lies in how we define respect. Is it honorable to meticulously document a baker's final moments, his carbonized loaf still in the oven? Or does that reduce his tragedy to a museum display? The Vatican's catacombs of St. Calixtus provide one model. Bones of early Christians are arranged reverently as relics, their identities lost but their sacrifice memorialized. Pompeii's victims receive no such sanctity. Their remains are catalogued like artifacts, their plaster forms rotated through blockbuster exhibitions. Perhaps the answer lies in nuance. At Herculaneum's House of the Skeletons, researchers left 3 bodies in situ under glass, allowing visitors to witness the scene exactly as the eruption preserved it, not as a spectacle, but as a silent testament. Nearby, a tablet explains the individuals' ages and probable relationships, honoring their humanity without dissection. This middle path, studying with sensitivity, displaying with dignity, might finally bridge the gap between knowledge and reverence. After all, the same volcanic ash that stole these lives also entrusted them to our keeping. How we choose to carry that responsibility will define Pompeii's legacy far more than any artifact we uncover. Pompeii's destruction became volcanology's birth certificate. When Pliny the Younger penned his eyewitness account of the eruption, describing the towering ash column like an umbrella pine and the suffocating pyroclastic surges, he unknowingly authored the first scientific document of a volcanic disaster. His meticulous notes on wind patterns, falling pumice, and even the odd behavior of birds laid the groundwork for modern hazard analysis. Today, volcanologists still refer to similar eruptions as Plinian in his honor, proving how one man's horror became the lexicon of an entire field. But Pompeii's gift to science didn't stop with ancient observations. The layers of ash that entombed the city act as a geological time capsule, preserving a precise sequence of volcanic events. By studying these strata like pages in a book, researchers decoded Vesuvius's eruption phases from the initial pumice fallout to the lethal gas surges, creating a template now used to predict behavior in active volcanoes from Iceland to Indonesia. Forensic archaeology owes its sharpest tools to Pompeii's ruins. The technique of pouring plaster into voids left by decomposed bodies, pioneered here in the 1800s, revolutionized how we investigate mass tragedies. Modern teams in war-torn regions like Bosnia and Rwanda adopted similar methods to identify victims of genocide, using soil stains and subtle depressions to reconstruct the final moments of those lost to violence. Pompeii's ash preserved more than bodies. It fossilized the physics of disaster. The angle of collapsed roofs revealed wind direction during the eruption, while the distribution of skeletons mapped deadly gas flow patterns. These insights now inform building codes in volcanic zones, dictating everything from roof pitch to evacuation corridor width. Even the city's infamous death shadows, ghostly outlines of victims vaporized by extreme heat, helped calibrate thermal models for nuclear blast impact studies. Cutting-edge tech continues to mine Pompeii for breakthroughs. LiDAR scans of the ruins exposed subtle ground deformations preceding the eruption, mirroring the satellite data now used to monitor Yellowstone's restless caldera. Chemists analyzing lead pipes in the water system discovered trace elements from the volcano's earliest gas releases, offering a blueprint for detecting silent killers in modern groundwater. Perhaps most strikingly, DNA extracted from Pompeian bones revealed not just ancestry, but genetic adaptations to environmental stress, clues that could aid disaster medicine today. The city's darkest hours birthed protocols that save thousands annually. The 6-tiered Volcanic Explosivity Index, which classifies eruptions from gentle Hawaiian oozes to catastrophic supervolcano events, draws direct parallels to 79 AD. Disaster drills worldwide now incorporate Pompeii scenarios to train responders for pyroclastic surges, while hazard maps color-code danger zones using the same principles that once marked Pompeii's fateful geography. Even space science benefits. NASA studies Vesuvius's eruption patterns to understand dust storms on Mars. Pompeii's greatest lesson isn't about the past, it's about preparedness. The same layers that buried a city now shield others, their secrets translated into early warning systems and reinforced infrastructure. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it was Pliny's descriptions that helped scientists anticipate its behavior. When Iceland's Eyjafjallajökull grounded European air travel in 2010, it was Pompeii's ash dispersion models that minimized economic fallout. The dead of this ancient city speak through seismographs and gas sensors, their tragedy rewritten as salvation. What began as an annihilation became, against all odds, a covenant between science and survival. Pompeii's tragedy transcends the label of natural disaster because of the names we can still whisper 2,000 years later. This wasn't just an eruption, it was a baker named Modestus dying beside his last batch of bread, a mother named Rectina pleading for rescue in a letter that never reached help, a child named Lucius whose tiny sandals still sit where he kicked them off to play. The ash didn't bury a city, it preserved a chorus of voices that refused to be reduced to statistics. What makes their stories unforgettable isn't the scale of destruction, but the intimate details. The half-mended sandal left by a doorway, the wax tablet with a shopping list scratched beside a love poem, the dog named Delicate straining against its chain. These aren't artifacts, they're frozen heartbeats. Modern disaster reports often focus on magnitude and casualty counts, but Pompeii teaches us that history's weight is measured in singular lives. When we read Pliny the Younger's account of ships trapped by floating pumas, we're not just studying volcanic activity, we're standing beside a 17-year-old boy watching his uncle suffocate on a beach. The difference between a geological event and a human tragedy lies in the graffiti on a tavern wall that reads, "Gaius was here," or the wedding ring still encircling a skeletal finger. These fragments force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nature's violence becomes meaningful only when we see it through the eyes of those who endured it. The call to remember isn't about nostalgia, it's about accountability. Today, as satellites monitor Yellowstone's tremors or drones map Indonesia's magma chambers, we have tools Pompeii's residents couldn't imagine. But technology means nothing without the humility to listen to the past. Those who fled Vesuvius's wrath left us more than ruins. They left a blueprint for resilience. The baker who reopened his ovens in Naples, the widow who rebuilt her family in Cumae, their choices echo in every modern disaster response plan, every evacuation route painted on a Neapolitan street. So when you next hear news of a rumbling volcano or a hurricane's approach, pause. Look beyond the headlines of destruction and ask, whose stories will this disaster tell? What laughter, what unfinished dreams, what ordinary acts of courage will be buried in the debris? Pompeii's legacy isn't just about respecting the dead, it's about honoring the living who inherit their warnings. The silent witnesses of history don't ask for monuments. They ask us to remember that disaster always wears a human face, and in that memory lies our best chance to rewrite